we bring you the third instalment of the Squadron Zoom Room series. Our talk is just about to commence. Tonight's speaker is investigative journalist Pamela Williams. I'd now like to introduce you to Gabrielle Hollis, also a Squadron member and member of our Speakers Committee, and she will introduce Pamela to us. Enjoy the talk.
Thanks, Frances. So tonight we have Pamela Williams, investigative journalist, talking about how it's done. First, I found a couple of quotes that I thought would help to set the scene. The first one, something that Julian Assange said that I think defines one aspect of investigative journalism. He said, "Reality is one aspect of property. It must be seized. And investigative journalism is the noble art of seizing reality back from the powerful." And another quote, this time by Hank Philippi Ryan, an award-winning mystery author and investigative journalist at R7 News in Boston, said, "At the core of investigative journalism is exactly the same thing that drives a page-turning thriller, telling a good story." And so to our guest speaker this evening, the renowned journalist Pamela Williams. Pam is one of Australia's most decorated journalists. She has won a total of 6 Walkley Awards, including the Gold Walkley Award in 1998. Other awards include the Graham Perkins Journalist of the Year Award, the George Munster Award for Independent Journalism, the Melbourne Press Club Quill Award, the Trawalla Arts Journalism Award, and the Citigroup Journalism Award. Pam has had a lengthy and distinguished career at many of our major media outlets. For most of the past 3 decades, she has been reporting for the Australian Financial Review. She has had a 2-year stint as executive producer for the 7:30 Report, and for 3 years she wrote for The Australian. Pam is also an author. She wrote the 1997 political campaign book, The Victory, and in 2013 she won the Walkley Book Award for the bestseller Killing Fairfax. And so to tonight's subject, Pam is going to give us an insider's account of the ins and outs of investigative journalism, that branch of the profession that uncovers corruption and wrongdoing in government and private enterprise, ranging from the Watergate scandal to our own Eddie Obeid. There is no one better qualified to tell us all about the dark arts of investigative journalism than Pam. Before I hand over to Pam, some housekeeping. I think Frances has already dealt with this, but for anybody who has come in late, Pam will speak for about 45 minutes and then there'll be a 15-minute period during which she will answer your questions. So you just need to type in your questions via the chat button on the Zoom app. Please type your questions as they occur to you whilst Pam is speaking, and Pam will be able to see your questions and answer them at the end. Pam will address them at the conclusion of the talk. And now I'd like to hand over to Pam to talk about the dark art of investigative journalism. Pam.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Hello, everyone. It does feel strange to be all communicating in these new ways, but we're all kind of getting used to it. So yes, I'm an investigative reporter and feature writer, and I have worked for the Financial Review for a very long time. It's been my home for most of my writing career. It's a marvellous newspaper. It's a small newspaper, but it does pack a punch. Now, I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm sure someone will signal if I'm not speaking loudly enough. But I'm going to give you some of the inside story on being an investigative journalist, and I hope that I might prompt some questions that will make you think about some things that you've always wanted to know. And I might tell you the answers, but I might be too nervous to tell you the answers on some of the questions you might come up with, but we can give it a go. So I've been an investigative reporter since 1994. So that's 26 years of doing the same thing. But is it always the same? Is it ever the same? Absolutely never. Every story is different when you're digging into things, and for all journalists as well as investigative journalists. But that's why after 36 years as a journalist, which is what I've had, and 26 years as an investigative journalist, each story is a news story for me. Some of them can take a very, very long time to do, and I'll talk about that in a little while. And some of them can be quite quick, and they literally hit you, and you have to move very quickly to get on top of them. So what does an investigative reporter do? Here are some questions. Do you get death threats? Where do the ideas come from? Is it always from a hot source, or do you pick a story idea up over coffee? How many whistleblowers are involved? How often are whistleblowers involved? Now, I'm not a crime reporter in the same vein as my good friend and colleague, the marvellous Kate McClymont, whom I'm sure you all read in the Sydney Morning Herald. I write mainly about federal politics and business, the corporate world, although sometimes I've had a foray into a completely different area that might have surprised me, but I'll follow where the story goes. It can be a big story on the fall of a prime minister. We've had, as we all know, 4 political assassinations of prime ministers in the last 10 years, which is a lot. And I tend to go underground for those stories for several weeks after the story has actually occurred. In other words, I'm not investigating the fall of a prime minister before it happens. It's once that story has happened. And I might then, it's another branch of what I do, I might then go underground and try to piece together what actually happened and how all of the power struggles. Now you have to bear with me while I struggle with some pieces of paper so I don't forget. How the power of all the machinations and how it's happened and who were the power brokers. So I might work on the stories like that, for example, as an investigator, where you commence almost at the end of the story where the horrors or the outrages happened. And this is something that investigative journalists do all the time. Now, for me, it might be, and I'll show you one page, it might be a story that you'll all be very familiar with, and I'll go and find out what happened behind the scenes and what really occurred. And there they are, Rudd and Gillard, and the headline, I think you might be able to see it, was, the headline on this is Kill Kevin, the untold story of a coup. Now, that's the 16th of July in 2010. Kevin Rudd was rolled 3 weeks beforehand. So for me, that's a pretty quick bit of work, 3 weeks. Most journalists have to do something every day, or maybe 3 stories every day. And I used to have to do that when I was a very young reporter. But I have the luxury now as an investigative journalist, but also the pressure on an investigative journalist is to get it right and get the story. But you always also have the luxury that you can take some time to go and dig out the story. So for the fall of a prime minister, for example, that will be something that I will try to then put together and dig it out as quickly as I can. 3 weeks is very fast for me, and I hope my boss isn't listening. You know, then you try to get that whole story out. Now, I'm not going to be bringing someone down or unpicking powerful apparatuses before they move when I'm doing the aftermath of the fall of the Prime Minister. But what I am doing is shining a light into some of the machinations and the plots and the planning that went on inside perhaps our elected government and our democratic system. So it's a branch of investigative journalism that I hope is very, very important. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Let me answer some of those earlier questions I posed. What does an investigative reporter, an investigative journalist do? Basically, you start with an idea or a tip-off or a demand from the editor of the newspaper or your TV network or your radio, wherever you work, and you to go and look into something. It's usually the germ of an idea, and you might just have a few threads of a story, just a few small threads, Or you might have this whole story completed, as I just said, like a political assassination. And you go out into the woods with this germ of an idea, or the threads, or something your boss has said he wants you to go look into. And you're more or less going into the woods with a notebook and a phone to dig out the full story. And that sounds, you know, there's a lot of contemporary investigative journalism that involves looking into people's Twitter accounts and looking into their Facebooks and all the rest of it. Speaking for myself, I don't work that way. I tend to go out with the notebook and the phone. And I find that that has always worked for me. And all journalists have different structures of how they work, but I can only talk about how I go. So often this might take me months to piece together and then to move story by story. I don't mean I take months to do one story. That's the sort of thing that major TV investigative programs might do. They might take 6 weeks to do something if you're getting a Four Corners story. But I might take story by story, and as I'm publishing each story, it might be a piece of what I'm going to build up by the end of it. And so you build up each new piece of evidence that you uncover. That, for example, is the way that the journalists at the Boston Globe in Boston built up piece by piece the extraordinary network of information and puzzles that created the crackdowns that occurred on pedophilia amongst the clergy in Boston. And many of you will have seen the movie Spotlight, which was about exactly that reporting, as the journalists got piece by piece, interview by interview, freak out after freak out. Were they right? Were they wrong? You know, did they have enough to go with in the paper? And steadily they built up what became an edifice that brought down some of the most powerful people in the city, in the church, and spread across the world, really. So it's like doing a jigsaw puzzle. Being patient is unbelievably important. If you're not patient, your time as an investigative journalist is not going to be well placed, because you're not going to give the thinking time to it and sketch out in your mind where different threads join up so that you can catch people and catch information. Think of some big stories that have shaken things up very much in our country and overseas. Think of the Eddie O'Bead story by Kate McClymont of recent years. Think of the phone hacking scandals in England in 2011. And then to come to my own stories, think of the government's secret plans to destroy the waterfront unions in 1998. These are all investigative stories that grew piece by piece, story by story, report by report, until all the cumulative pieces give you the big picture of what happened. And those stories, those events, have all shaken the powers that be. Corruption, wrongdoing, immorality, accountability being sought, hidden secrets being uncovered, shining a light. That's investigative journalism. So, people often ask me, do you get death threats? Well, probably because I write about politics, I don't get so many death threats. I think people just imagine perhaps that they'd like to give me death threats, but nobody would do so. I've only ever gotten death threats that were serious once, and that was way back in the 1980s from a very big union boss who was furious about me writing about trade union corruption in which he was involved, that I'd uncovered, and he threatened that guns would be brought out and they knew where I lived. Now, nothing happened, but I was very uneasy for months. Friends of mine who are investigative journalists who have worked in very direct corruption in recent years have definitely had death threats. And that can really make your entire family unsteady. We know investigative journalists do get killed in other countries, by and large, here in Australia, we're very fortunate that such threats are rare. But they do come along when you threaten the vested interest and also big piles of money that are sometimes deeply related and interconnected to, corruption. So where do the ideas come from? Do we get our ideas from a hot sauce or over a coffee? For me, the ideas for a story come from all of these. Often I'll be watching a developing story that's already running in the media, and I'll think, there's something more to this, and I'll get an itch about that story. And that itch tells me that if I start digging, I'm going to find something. Now, that's because of long time of experience, that knowing that you can sort of see behind, you can see through walls sometimes, because you get a sixth or a seventh or an eighth sense about what might be happening. And you might know a little bit about a story, but not everything about the latest version of it. And you might think, I just have to get in there and start digging. So I would then go in this circumstance. Someone asked me recently how often my newspaper, my boss, tells me what he'd like me to do. So I'll come to that in a minute. It can be a bit of a tussle sometimes. But in the situation where I've gotten an itch or I've seen a story that's developing, I haven't necessarily had any whistleblowers, but I've seen something that's got me absolutely fascinated. I'll go in to see my editor and I'll run it past him. And I would probably do some work in my head. Hang on, I've got to get another bit of paper moved. I'll probably do some work in my head beforehand so that I've got the ammunition to sell that story to my boss. If I sell the story, I mean, I'm going to talk him into it, because in the end, I might like to come up with my own ideas, and journalists do, but in the end, you've got to get it into the paper or onto the TV or on radio or online, whatever your publishing platform is. And unless your boss is going to back you when you're an investigative reporter, unless the editor is going to back you, you are really maybe not going to get it into print, and you are maybe going to be in strife even finding the time to do it. So getting the editor behind you means you have to engage the editor. You have to have done enough work, have some smart enough ideas about it, and hopefully have a bit of evidence already by the time you go in. And in that case, if it's a good editor, you usually find they go, absolutely, go and see what you can bring me back. Now, it might not be something crooked. It might be, for example, in my case, that I think there's a huge and fascinating story to be dug out about a corporate takeover. So that may not be uncovering something that is wrongdoing, but it might be what they call in America, they call it a TikTok. Here we sort of call it, a long narrative and a long story of behind the scenes. In America, they call it a TikTok. It's like a clock, and you sort of, this happened and then this happened and then this happened and then this happened and this happened and this happened. So it's the TikTok of what happened next. So not only might I find a story that I think really warrants telling. It might be a huge corporate takeover, for example, the takeovers between AMP and AXA a few years back. And it's going to be all very well if I think I can dig out the real story behind the scenes of what happened as all these chief executives from Sydney to Paris negotiated, and what all the investment banks who got brought on board did, and how much money they made, and what their advice was, and how the whole dance unfolded. But if you're going to do that, you also have to be able to tell the story. And if you can't tell the story in a narrative that keeps the reader going, then your boss isn't going to give you another go at it. So it's very, very important to learn how to actually tell the story in a way that is extremely compelling, because not only is that what sells newspapers, or TV or radio, but it's what gets people watching, it's what gets people's attention. and it gives you the opportunity to keep following up the story, and then you actually do bring something home that really kind of engages people. My story might be, for example, the inside story of an art dealer where the art is not what it seems, and I've done quite a number of those. I've chased stories that were about fake art, and I've investigated at some points the transparency of art auction rooms. People have sometimes said to me, oh, you know, do you sometimes do stories on art because it's a break from the terrible world of politics and some of those gruesome stories that you do? And I say, well, actually, they're all about on the same level sometimes. You know, when something is rotten, it doesn't matter whether it's in the art world, the political world, inside the institutions of power that include our churches, or anywhere else. So, you know, if it smells, investigative journalists will go and chase it. Sometimes my editor or my editor-in-chief, those are the two people who run the Financial Review, they might have a story that they want me to chase. They might have a really good idea, they think, and they often do. Now, the boss can be very persuasive, basically because he's the boss. Sometimes journalists have got other things that they want to be working on themselves, but if the boss really wants you to work on something, you more or less, you know, you've got to have a very good reason not to, which would basically be a better story. I did once do my best for 6 months to avoid a story idea from my boss, as I had an agenda to cover in a different area. But he hassled me, and he would sit at his desk and he would say, you have to do this, you have to do this, please do it. And I finally said, I'll give it a go. But I said to him, but others have gone before me on this story. It was a big player in business, and he wanted me to find out about this guy and capture, in a way, the things that he was doing. So I said, I'll give it a go. But for me, the paper trail is very, very critical, because you have to have a paper trail as an investigative journalist. It's the absolute key thing. You've got to have the proof. And if you're pursuing leads that are very controversial around very powerful people, you really, really do need to have evidence. You know, investigative journalists can't go just chasing people and saying, oh, I think this has happened, and not have evidence. You know, there's a very, very, very significant burden of proving and evidence and stacking up the story on investigative journalists. And if you can't do that, you really are going to have a lot of trouble getting your stories into the paper, because you're going to be on the other end of legal action. So in the situation I've just mentioned, where my boss had a story he really wanted me to do for a long time, I did give it a go. And after about a month, I went back to my editor and I said to him, look, I can't get the paper trail. I can't get anyone to talk on the record. You know, I'm going round and round. I was allowed to let that go, even though the boss was desperate for the story, but he trusted that I'd tried and failed on that one. 6 months later, I was still annoyed with myself that I'd failed. And I quietly, in my spare time or early in the morning, hit the phones again, calling some news sources. And that time I had a different result. This is back in, let me think, to the early 2000s, I think, or thereabouts. I had a different result. That story, eventually, I got some sources, and it took me a year and dozens of reports, but it resulted in the end in the overturning, I can't mention the name, but it resulted in the overturning of a culture and a regime inside a big company and action by regulators. I also had a very happy boss who correctly reminded me many times that it had been his idea. Now, sometimes a story idea comes directly from a source that you've had for a long time, and who might be someone who's worked in lots of different industries. People in the political world often move around a lot. They might be in politics, they might be advisors, they might be consultants, they might go into the wider world and do other things, but they always stay connected and they always have a lot of information. So you might get an idea on a story from a source that you've known who isn't necessarily connected directly to what you're going to work on. But they might tell you about something you've heard, and that might be where you hear something over a cup of coffee, the famous sort of notion of investigative journalists sort of being out and picking these things up, and that certainly does happen. Or it might be a whistleblower who just comes out of nowhere. So one such story for me, which had really a large group of sources in the end that I'd known for ages through other stories. But this story also, as well as all my old sources, had a critical whistleblower. Now, that was the big waterfront stories of 1998. I'll show you a couple of front pages in a minute to show you how the Financial Review downplayed the story when I first published it. And the reason I'll tell you about it in a moment, the reason they downplayed the story was because it was what I was describing earlier, that you have to have a lot of evidence, you have to be very sure, but the paper trail is very important. Now, on this one, at the beginning, I really didn't have a great big paper trail, so the editor wasn't really willing to give it a huge run. He gave it a good run, but not a huge run because he was nervous. It's a long time ago now, but it was a gigantic story at the time. And it was all about the Howard government and some big companies trying to break the waterfront unions. And some of you may remember that, I'm sure. The first break in the story, let's my bit of paper to remind me of the details. The first break in the story did come from someone I had known who told me on the phone when we were chatting about something else that, oh, he knew about the government that was going to try and crack a trade union and destroy them on the docks, and that they were happy to have all of the wharves closed, and they might even bring troops onto the docks to run the Australian waterfront. Now, I was absolutely amazed, but this was a very good source. It was someone I'd known for a long time, a very steady person. So what do you do when you have that first piece of the puzzle? You have to try to find another source who might know more. Because if you take a piece of information like that the federal government is going to try to destroy a trade union and is thinking about bringing troops onto the docks, and back in those days the unions were far stronger than they are now, you really can't just go roaming out with that story and think you'll pop it in the paper, much though people often do think that journalists just get hold of a story and they just put it in the paper and nothing's checked, and people think that, which is almost always not the case. So if I want to find out what the federal government, whether the federal government is planning on destroying the wharfies, I don't just go out and call someone in the government because they're not going to tell me. So instead, and here's a little bit of how I work, instead I try very hard to think of, and I do this in every story I work on, I try to think about who the government might be talking to, who the person, the area that I want to look into. I won't go and talk just to their critics. I'll think about who would it be that these people are talking to, and those are the people I will go and try to find. So I would try to work out at that time who the government itself might have been discussing these so-called secret plans to break the wharfies on the docks and bring troops in. I tried to think about who I knew or who I could approach who might have heard something about this. And so you go piece by piece. When I was sure, so I did that for quite a while, when I was sure that the story was right, I then went to my editor and I said, look, I've got all of this. I've got some very good sources, multiple sources. I've got absolutely nobody on the record, though. No one will talk on the record to say that this is being planned. But I'm ready to call the government now and put it to them and see what they say. So my boss was very nervous, my editor at the time. In the end, I wrote a big story on this with all of the background information, and I'll show it to you. It's a very old piece of newspaper here. This is August 1997. And there under my finger is I wonder if you can see that, is the story. And it's down the side of the page, straight down there. And the headline is Coalition's Secret Plan to Break the Docks Union. So I wrote the story, we published it with all the background, and then we waited to see the reaction. And this is often the case for investigative journalists. It's a very miserable time. We waited and waited, and there was no reaction. We waited and waited. Now, the story was not splashed across the top of the page. It was down the side because we were a little anxious. We were nervous. It was a big story, but the government is a very, very large and powerful institution to take on. So eventually, after a few months, something happened. And there were reports of a secret workforce training in Dubai, a bunch of mercenaries. The ABC had some coverage on this. Somebody's Sydney Morning Herald had some coverage. The story started rolling. And it seemed that there was a secret workforce training in Dubai to replace the Australian wharfies. Suddenly, this was all out in the open. But the federal government still, and this is how things work, flatly denied that it had anything to do with the mercenaries being trained in Dubai, nor did they know anything about it. So I've started this anecdote by telling you about the source that I knew, and then I'm going to move to the next part. So several months go by, and that's when the secret whistleblower started helping me. I received an envelope in the post in December, so that's 4 months after the first story, which had been greeted with absolute silence and nobody followed up until finally there were some mercenaries in Dubai. And suddenly, months later, I receive in the post a plain brown envelope with my name and my title and the address of the Financial Review on a square of paper that is glued onto the front of the envelope. It didn't take me long to work out that the square of paper in the middle of the envelope was actually a photocopy of my own business card. And it was glued onto the front. Someone had gotten hold of my business card, photocopied it, sent me, and inside the envelope were pages of internal government memos between ministers and their advisors, outlining the strategy to bust the union, all the way right down to the fact that they might need to bring troops onto the docks. And so then it was on for young and old. And all of us covered that story. Journalists on every TV network, radio, newspapers. It went on for about a year. I'll show you the front page of the memos. When I got those memos from the whistleblower, doc plot. There's the newspaper, the dot plot, how to kill a union. So my boss was unbelievably relieved. He was unbelievably happy, but he was unbelievably relieved because, you know, our first story, which he had taken an awful lot of flack behind the scenes from federal government ministers over running this complete and utter rubbish, which is what people call your story before you get the evidence, complete and utter rubbish and garbage and invented nonsense and, you know, what are we running all of this for? So some months later, we've actually got the paper trail, which is these memos between ministers and their advisors, which are sent to me by a whistleblower. The whistleblower did eventually write to me separately, and I was able to meet him with my notebooks. And by the way, I don't take I don't take shorthand. I take all my notes longhand. So it's a very laborious process for me. I don't tape because it takes too long to transcribe the tape, but I can write pretty darn quickly. So anyway, I covered the story for about a year and I won some awards for that story. Handling anonymous sources is one issue that comes up in the context of that story. And in fact, for almost all of the stories that investigative journalists write, whistleblowers and people who agree to talk to a journalist on what we call background need to have cover. Let's just throw another bit of paper on the ground. Background, the term background means that people will tell you some of what has happened, but they don't want their names used. They could get fired, they could be sued, but nevertheless, talking to sources on background is the central tenet of investigative journalism. And it's up to us as journalists to both keep the sources safe and also to make sure that what they tell us is right. How do you do that? How do you keep the sources safe? You do it by not telling anyone else who those sources are. You do it also by cross-checking everything someone tells you. You have to find other sources. You have to have cross-checking because, you know, everybody remembers something different. If you think about somewhere that you've been, perhaps a party or a dinner party, you know, in those things we did in the old days before January, and you can run into people later and someone will tell you some gossip that they heard from that dinner party. And you'll say, oh no, but I was there and I heard something else. And then you'll later tell someone else, you'll say, oh, I ran into so-and-so and they said this has happened at the dinner party that we were both at, but I told them, no, this happened. And your friend will say, well, I was there as well with you, but I remember something else. Now, everybody remembers something different. You can have 5 people in a room and they'll have 5 different memories. However, there will be common pieces of information within those 5 memories. So what a journalist is looking for is the common pieces of information in those 5 sets of information, or 3. We try to have 3 sources if we're running something that's anonymously. So you do this with legwork, basic legwork. You find other sources, you check the information backwards and forwards, phone calls, more questions. There are never, ever too many phone calls. And the phone call that you don't make because you might be rushing is going to be the one that you wish you had made as an investigative journalist. And I can't tell you how many times I've made that one last phone call because I've just still been a little bit worried about some little part of a story and I've thought of someone else I can check it with and they've said, no, that person wasn't in the room at that time. And I'll say, what do you mean? I'll be asking about someone. I'll be saying, you know, there was a room with 5 people. There was this one, this one, this one, this one. And this one said this and that one said that. And I'll check it with a 6th person I will have thought about, well, who I might have just remembered or managed finally to get them to return a phone call. And they'll say, no, that person wasn't in the room. And I will panic because I've been about to write a story where I've got that one of these people in the room, and I'll go back to that person then who I thought was in the room but isn't, and I'll say, when you said so-and-so, are you sure you were in the room? And the person will say, no, I said that to someone outside the room. I wasn't in the room. And so you'll find this can happen over and over again. You'll find that the final phone call might find that all of your information is right, but you haven't necessarily got all the people in the right place. So the power and virtue of fact-checking and double-checking sources is just unbelievably critical. And when journalists get things wrong, if they're good investigative journalists, you can be very sure it's because of an accident of one final thing where there was something that was, it's usually not intended, and it's usually just some small crack in the thing that someone has said something, it's been passed on, and they weren't quite there, but they were nearby. Now, that can often cause a lot of trouble, of course, and I can't think of the number of times newspapers over the years have run, for example, a small apology on page 2 that says, company XYZ, you know, the newspaper reported last week that company XYZ was close to going into administration. You know, we withdraw this is a different sort of a thing. This isn't the person who wasn't in the room, but where this, what I'm telling you here does happen a lot. There might have been a massive number of stories, and it'll finish up with company XYZ's going into administration, and we'll get 10 legal letters, and we'll put an apology onto page 2 saying company XYZ, you know, has pointed out they're not going into administration. You know, we unreservedly apologise. I cannot tell you how many times 1 week later company XYZ is in administration, and the journalist who wrote the story is in uproar on the newspaper because, you know, the lawyers have forced you to run an apology. But it's in a way that's okay, because all the front pages then say the company's in administration, and everybody is, you know, even more outraged at them. So how long do I have to get the story once I come up with an idea? Look, it can be a couple of days if it's something that is absolutely pulsing out there and it takes 1 or 2 phone calls, but usually it can be about 4 weeks. Now, I don't usually travel. A lot of journalists will travel a great deal if they're investigating something. Some of the fantastic journalists in Australia who are doing work on, I don't know, big casino stories and things might do a lot of travel. I don't tend to travel. My stories are not expensive. I basically just sit on the phone with a notebook and take, you know, umpty 100 pages of longhand. Now, I wrote myself a note to tell you how will I know how many words to write? So I'm somebody for whom no amount of words is going to be too much. And I've had a fight with an editor only this morning about something where he said I could have 2,000 words, which for me is like nothing. And I said to him, you know, I'm yours if I can have 3,000 words. And it's a very significant story he wants, and I don't think even 3,000 words is enough space. I think maybe 6,000. He's giving me 2,000. And the reason is that advertising has gone down. We've got a hideous pandemic. The economy is in trouble, and media companies are trying to do as well as they can with very little advertising. So newspapers and magazines get smaller. So one of my bosses said I could have 2,000 words. I've negotiated that. You'll be pleased to hear up to 2,500, although the story won't come out until October. But often I've written stories that are 9,000 words. My record is really about 16,000 words. Those are very, very, very big stories. They're usually the aftermath of federal election campaigns, and they're 4-part series. I might start to write the actual story. I start with federal elections. My way of investigating what happens in a campaign, I write about election campaigns. I like the inner mechanics of an election campaign, the war rooms, not the politicians, but the war rooms behind them. And I start writing those stories. I don't talk to anybody at the office while I'm writing them and researching them for the whole of the campaign. I disappear, and then I start writing the morning after the election, and the morning of the election, and the Monday after that, we start publishing a 4-part series, and we run 4,000 words every day until we've got 16,000 words in the paper, and then I take leave for a week and lie down in a very dark room. So 9,000 words used to be a great story length for me. Now I'm lucky to be able to do 5 or 6, but we will still run. Newspapers are fine things, and they will still run for a very big story, a 2-part series, you know, 6,000 words. So these are long narratives, and I can tell you the one very important thing in addition to the information that you bring, is that you have to be able to write that story so that people read it to the end, not click off halfway through. Because these days, you might be an investigative journalist and you might be fantastic at what you do if you're lucky, but if people start clicking off online halfway through reading the story, the people who run parts of our business now can tell. They can measure it. They can see where readers dropped off and stopped reading. And if you have got a drop-off rate, you know, you're not going to get your 6,000 words. So I'm pretty careful to try and make my story something that people want to read. And so probably the only other question that goes with that is, how do you know if it's a page one story? I think that's something that just comes with experience. The editor knows, and usually the reporter knows, because you know that you've uncovered something or brought some extraordinary information to a remarkable story, and that it's going to be something that will be wanted to be read and will sell newspapers. And long-form journalism, I think, is still alive and well. So I think that's what I had to tell you about the inside story.
Pam, thank you. We have some questions. It sounds as though it's a very stressful occupation at times. Do you worry about being sued? Can you get insurance for what you do?
Okay. I think I probably, for decades, have worried about being sued all the way through every story. I tend to think of myself, and journalists of my vintage, in other words, you've written, I don't mean I'm terribly old, although perhaps I am, but I mean you've written a lot of stories over the years. So you get to know what you're likely to be able to publish, and you become almost a self-lawyer in a way. And so that makes, I'm of the view that you can get most things into print. It's a question of how you phrase something. And you have to be very careful. Sometimes you have to phrase, if you've got something very tough to write, because you are always worried in Australia that you'll be sued, because our defamation laws are very, very strong. The bar is very, very high for journalists and very low for people who want to sue them. You have to be extremely alert the whole time. And I am of the view that you can publish an awful lot depending on how you write it. Sometimes you just have to say, you know, this could give the impression of being blah, and you know, you really have to put caveats around it, because you can't defame people. You have to be very careful. And so I do worry about being sued. I worry about it all the time. All the investigative journalists I know here and overseas worry about that all the time, and it makes us write. It doesn't make us pull our punches, but it makes us work very carefully, and it still doesn't protect everybody.
So you think about the court case when you're doing a story, you're assessing the downside.
Absolutely. It doesn't make you not do the story, but it does make you be very careful. And that's where this cross-checking with sources and that last phone call and the paper trail in particular. I'm a devotee of the paper trail, because if you've got it on paper, you have got some evidence. It doesn't mean that you can go ahead and defame people. You still have to be very careful. We have very tough laws in this country, but you know, you have information upon you which you can rest some of your case, and certainly can inform the way that you write. But you have to be always mindful of defaming people, and just as bad is getting things wrong. So you know, it's not an easy job. It's you spend a lot of time thinking about being right, and as soon as the story is published, and I can only speak for myself as a newspaper writer, then you stay awake all night worrying. All night. As soon as it's gone and you can't get it back, then you commence the worrying, and it doesn't stop.
One of the questions that's just come in, you sort of alluded to this in one of your earlier comments. How do you keep stories readable, especially long stories?
Well, we've probably all got our different ways of doing this, but for myself, I do like to build a bit of colour into my stories, by which I like to find anecdotes and tell them in an interesting way, almost as little stop points throughout the story. I think when you write a very long story, now if it's an absolute breaking story of corruption, you're not going to be stopping with colourful anecdotes. But if it's a very long story about the inside story of the fall of a prime minister, at the beginning of last year I wrote 15,000 words on the fall of Malcolm Turnbull. That's a very long story. That's a very, very long essay. And you really have to pay great attention to building anecdotes into the story and making little stops where you then change the time. And I constantly tell people what the weather might be like. I tell people what date it is. Then I tell people how many days have gone by since the last thing that I referenced on something. And I try to help the reader through the story by giving them signposts all the way through in that way, to keep, if it's a very long political piece in particular.
Right. The AFP raid on Annika Smethurst, I know that the High Court decided that the search warrant was invalid, but do you think that shows a worrying trend of government interference with press freedom?
Well, it certainly did. Absolutely it did. It was, well, and in fact it was more than a trend, it was an actuality. So that was a very, very worrying thing for all of us, and there was a great deal of activity from journalists and media organisations to protest about that. I think that it's quite likely that the profound opposition from the media industry and from many people who, you know, support a media industry by being consumers of media, people who believe in a fourth estate and a democratic reporting structure. You know, if you've got people being raided for their notes and their information, then sources are not going to talk to you. And if sources are not going to talk to you, it's going to be the big cataclysmic stories that won't come out. Because sources will be too frightened. I've done so many stories, I can hardly even think of how many of them there are, where, you know, had I thought that my notes could be seized, and the damage that would have been done to individuals if I thought the authorities could come and seize my notes would be just devastating. And I think it was very frightening for sources. So yes, it was a very, very worrying trend, and we'll hope that we're not going to see too much more of it again.
I hope so. Pam, what motivates you to write a book?
Well, the first book I wrote, I've only written two, and there was many years between them because I found it so unbelievably hard. Lots of my friends are having a new book every year. You know, people, you know, stop having families and start having books as the years go by. The first one, I was harassed into it by my then boss at the Financial Review, who was absolutely determined that I would write a campaign book on the 1996 election that saw Paul Keating defeated and John Howard elected, which was an extraordinary election for Australia, an extraordinary election in every way. And my boss insisted that he wanted me to write a book about it, and he said, I'll give you the time off, all the rest of it. And anyway, it took me a year. So that one I was pushed into, and it was a very successful book, and I was very proud of it when it was done. But it took me years to, I always said, I'm not going to do another one until I find an idea that I can't resist. So many, many years later, when I wrote, I've got a copy of it here, this one, Killing Fairfax, which is a funny title for someone working at Fairfax. It was literally the company which I loved was falling in many ways. It was in trouble. And I happened to be having lunch with some people to discuss other matters. And as I wrote at the beginning of the book, one of them was James Packer and the other one at lunch was Lachlan Murdoch. And at the lunch that I had with these two, which were for various other reasons, they were bragging about the damage they were doing to Fairfax, they had done, and talking about what they'd achieved as competing companies against Fairfax. And and they ran through some of the things that they'd done. And I was so astonished. I had no idea of any of this. And I thought, I actually have to write about this. This is, you know, if their plan was how to destroy Fairfax, I have to do a book about this and find out what they did, how it happened, and what happened at the end. So that was how that book came about. It was unbelievably difficult, a controversial book to do. And in the end, you know, they didn't kill Fairfax. Fairfax had damaged itself by missing out on a lot of the digital age. And in the years since, it has, in the most extraordinary way, managed to rebuild a great deal in narrower areas to enable it to be sustained. Now, these are very tough times for media, but Fairfax did keep going, and it had some extraordinary journalists, and that journalism is kind of the backbone for newspapers. Those who run and own newspapers think journalism is part of it, and the commercial side is bigger. We journalists think the journalism is what carries it, and without it, all the advertisements in the world wouldn't have people buying the papers. So, but what inspires me to write a book, and it'll be a long time to write another one, I think, is a story that is just so irresistible that you just have to tell it. And that is certainly the case, I think, for all of my friends who are journalists who are writing books these days. And there are a lot of them. You'll see books by journalists coming out constantly these days, way different to what it used to be. And it's because they cannot resist telling that great big long story.
With everything with newspapers being largely digital these days, have you had to change your style much because it's not a paper format anymore so much?
No, I haven't. I haven't really changed the way I work a great deal. I actually thought that the digital age would mean I might be able to write stories that were 20,000 words long. And because they could just run them endlessly. It's digital, you know, I don't ever have to put the full stop and write the end. But turned out that that was not to be. And my bosses are in charge of me, and what they say goes. So it hasn't really changed the way I work, except for the fact that I've become such an avid digital reader, and I'm very engaged as a writer with the way my stories appear in the newspaper and everything else. So, you know, if I wake up in the morning when my story is online, it's in the newspaper and it's online, I'm looking at it immediately to see, you know, whether perhaps a photo or some part of some of the presentation, you know, how that's going, and that then encourages me next time to try to find some photos myself to write some of the captions and help with that production process, because digital presentation of stories can be absolutely fantastic. Now, I do happen to think, and you'll say I'm talking my own book here, but I do happen to think the Fin Review does a very fantastic job, really, in the way we present big stories. So, you know, it does give you an opportunity to give the readers more stops and starts as well, because they can get to some photos, read a few little paragraphs around that tell a bit of a story, and then they can sort of keep going. I think it's, you know, I think the mix of digital and print, for as long as we have print, is pretty fantastic. You know, we've got a lot of readers. Everyone is building their digital subscriptions. It's hard. It's a really tough world, but I am optimistic. You know, we've gotten through the worst days when the internet nearly swept us all onto the beach, you know, and we've found a way to keep going and do well.
Look, I think 9 o'clock's approaching. I wanted to ask you what you thought of the Geoffrey Rush verdict, but might have to save that for another time.
Perhaps for another time.
Yes. Pam, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. Hopefully when life settles down, we can welcome you back to the squadron and have a real talk and meal again. Thanks so much, and good night to everybody.
And good night from me. Thanks, Gabrielle.
Thanks, Pam.